The American Progress Center finds that of the 24 states that mandate sex education, only a handful address consent and healthy relationships. 10 states and the District of Columbia mention the terms sexual assault, consent, or healthy relationships in their sex education programs. That means the majority of public school students in the U.S. are not taught how to identify healthy and unhealthy relationship behaviors. Monica Rivera is the director of the Women and Gender Advocacy Center at Colorado State University. My colleague Rena Ninan spoke to her about when parents should start having conversations about consent with their kids.
First off, I want to ask you, how early is too early when it comes to teaching children about consent?
Yeah, I think that that's actually the entire point of how we need to be shifting what we're talking about consent. I don't think it's ever too early. I think that we often make the mistake of not treating the topic of consent the way we treat other elements of what we talk about or what we teach kids. So, for example, we don't wait until kids are, seniors in high school to teach all elements of math because now they're old enough to understand calculus. We teach age-appropriate levels of math all throughout K through 12. And so I think that we really need to be shifting the way that we're talking about consent in similar ways so that we're teaching age-appropriate concept of consent from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. Obviously, that does mean that we need to disentangle the topic of consent, though, from the topic of sex. Obviously, we're not going to be teaching kindergartners about sex, but there are ways that we can be teaching them about the concepts of body sovereignty and about respecting each other's bodies and understanding what it means to have body autonomy from as early of an age as possible. In my own family, we started when my kiddos were, even under the age of 1.
Wow. So how do you do that? How do you separate sex from that conversation around consent?
Yeah, I think that in reality, we already do that in a lot of ways. So we have a culture of consent in most of our daily interactions. So I would never just walk over and drink out of somebody's water bottle or, grab a pen out of someone's hand. We say, hey, is this seat taken? Can I borrow your sweatshirt? And so we have a pretty rich and nuanced way of talking about consent before we do things to or with other people's possessions. So, if I ask to borrow your car, to go to Target, it's safe to assume that doesn't mean wherever I want, whatever Target I want in the entire country, right? And so we have a way of understanding how to check in with each other around consent. So I think what we need to do, though, is to be able to set that foundation as it relates to bodies. We unintentionally undermine consent and the concept of consent with kids as it relates to bodies all the time. So when we say things like, oh, you're not cold, or you're not really hungry. What we're doing, although it seems silly, we're teaching kids that, first that they're not the experts on what's happening with their bodies, but also that we don't believe them whenever they're talking to us. And why this is important, too, to disentangle consent from the topic of sex is because, most, childhood sexual abuse doesn't start with sex. So folks who perpetrate childhood sexual abuse often start in very small, seemingly like minor boundary violations. And so if we're not teaching kids that they have the right to determine what happens to their bodies outside of the frame of sex, then it's very unlikely that they're going to be coming forward to discuss some of those boundary violations, and it's harder to then intervene.
Monica, you talk about body literacy. What is body literacy and how do you teach that?
Yeah, so body literacy, if you ask any, early childhood educator what literacy means, they'll tell you it's more than just teaching a kid how to read and write. It's teaching a kid how to understand the world around them, how to engage in the world around them. And it's the same thing with body literacy. And so it's about teaching kids how to understand their own bodies. That means teaching age-appropriate, anatomically correct names for body parts, teaching them to be the ones who are talking in doctor's appointments about what's happening with their bodies, if they have questions about their bodies. It's about teaching them how to read facial cues and body language. So if I'm reading a book to my son, I might say, how do you think this character's feeling right now based on facial expressions? Or if I see my son playing with a friend, I might say, pay attention to her face. Does it look like she's enjoying that game? So body literacy, like I said, is about teaching kids to read cues. And while that might seem really small, in reality, I've worked on a college campus for over a decade in the area of sexual violence prevention. And, most people know that kicking and screaming means no. Most people know that. What I can tell you though, is that many college students that I work with don't necessarily understand though that things like, I'm not sure, maybe we should wait, let's slow down, that those are also signals that someone doesn't want to move forward. And so teaching these early cues around body language is critical for laying a foundation to then later be able to apply the topic to sex.
So when it comes to boys versus girls, should our approach to teaching consent be any different?
No, I mean, at first, no, I don't think so. I don't think kindergartners, I don't think you need to differentiate regardless of where someone falls on a gender continuum. You know, they need to be learning about body sovereignty, that their body belongs to them, that other people have the right to say what happens to their bodies. Now, as you get into, late elementary school, middle school, that's when the research shows that there are gender stereotypes and gender norms that start to come into play. Girls start to feel shame around setting boundaries. They're worried that they'll be perceived as rude. Boys start to feel more entitled to accessing other people's bodies. And so that it is really important that we, as kids are getting older, that we are sending gender-specific messages. The other reality is that, in one of my classes, I do an activity where I ask students to spend 24 hours giving and receiving explicit verbal consent, meaning that before they touch anybody, they have to first stop and ask for consent. And before they let anyone touch them, even a good friend who has their arms outstretched for a hug, they have to pause and say, wait, will you ask me for consent? And the reactions that students have are deeply gendered. So the women in my class have a tremendous amount of anxiety asking people to ask for consent first. And then a lot of the men in my class really go through the experience and realize that they touch a lot of people, like all day, without even asking. And we know that sexual violence, particularly on a college campus, is a gendered phenomenon. So the vast majority of perpetrators, regardless of whether the victim is male or female or trans, identify as male. And I don't say that to shame or blame men at all. But we are really looking at a gendered phenomenon. And so it's important that we're educating boys. What does it mean to ask for consent?
A lot of what we teach children about consent is really taught at home. So how do we educate, at what age? And when you talk to education schools, there's traction growing to teach children in many states. It's actually passed legislation on this. So how do you teach children at home, and what should be done at schools?
Yeah, I have an entire TED Talk, and there's lots of people that do lots of trainings about specific strategies. I think that in K through 12, though, first it's important that we're modeling it before we're teaching it. And so what that looks like, I know I've seen lots of videos recently with educators who will allow students to choose when they're entering the classroom, do you want a hug, a high five, or a wave? It seems silly, but those again are the building blocks that lay a foundation that allow kids to really claim their own body sovereignty. I also think modeling with other adults, so within the school system or even within a home, modeling what does it look like to say, hey, would you like a hug? But then I think even more importantly, letting our kids see us say, no thanks, not today, and then say, okay, cool. So we can also model that it's really not a big deal to be rejected. There's some new data that's come out around teen dating violence and how rejection and jealousy really is fueling violent behavior, in particular on the part of young boys. And so I think modeling that in our schools, that it's okay to let other people set their boundaries, is critically important. I also think that we can be sloganizing messages. So rather than just telling kids, oh, be gentle, or, don't touch, that we say things like, be careful with bodies, or your body, your choice, that we turn them into slogans that we're saying, we don't shame bodies in my classroom. If you say that every week in your class, it's going to lay a foundation. And so I think modeling some of that is really critically important. Once we do get into sex ed, I think there's lots of approaches to teaching consent. I think that making sure that we're talking about pressure and coercion is critical. Like I said, most people understand that kicking and screaming is a clear no, but they don't necessarily understand that some of those other messages like silence or I'm not sure, maybe we should wait, that those also are signals that someone is not giving consent.
Consent is especially important when you talk about college campuses. Can you explain we've talked about the growing role of alcohol, but what's the responsibility of universities when it comes to teaching and also enforcing consent on campus?
Yeah, I appreciate that you bring up alcohol. I think that, yes, it's absolutely important that we're talking about alcohol on college campuses. And sometimes it troubles me a little bit how much emphasis we place on alcohol as a conversation around preventing sexual violence, in particular because what we're mostly talking about is how can we talk to students about reducing their intake of alcohol, which really means we're talking to potential victims about what can you do to reduce your risk of being harmed. And while that might be important, we can't really lose sight of talking to potential perpetrators around how are you making sure that you're not using alcohol as a tool to loosen someone up. If I use another sort of social issue that we as a culture have tried to tackle, think about drinking and driving. And in the 80s, when we were really trying to really wrestle with this as a social issue, we went after really marketing towards potential perpetrators. We said, don't drink and drive. You drink, you drive, you lose. All the educational messages were around don't drink and drive. We did a little bit of bystander intervention around, friends don't let friends drive drunk. But we didn't really say, don't go out after 10 o'clock at night because you could be harmed by a drunk driver. In reality, when it comes to sexual violence on college campuses, we've spent almost 3 decades targeting victims around things like know where the blue lights are and carry pepper spray and, learn self-defense. And while those things might be valuable in and of themselves in individual experiences, if self-defense was the answer to ending rape, women in the military would never be raped. They're literally trained to kill. And yet they have some of the highest rates of rape. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's important that we're talking about alcohol as one factor, but that really shouldn't be the focus where universities are really leaning into talking about this. In terms of responsibility, I think that I work on a college campus. I think that we like to really think of ourselves as being the leaders of new and innovative ideas and, being brave and talking about topics that are hard to talk about. And because of that, because we already have a foundation of talking about hard things, I think we have a greater responsibility to make sure we're also talking about sexual violence. And then the other thing, I said earlier, we need to disentangle consent from the topic of sex. But in reality, once college students are here, we don't need parental permission to talk about sex in the ways that you do in high school. And a lot of our students are first engaging in sexual relationships. So the timing is just ripe for us to be really fusing back together consent and sex. And so because of that, I think that colleges and universities, beyond just the federal mandates that come from Title IX and Campus Save and, et cetera, but we have sort of a moral obligation during this developmental age to really be diving deep in talking about consent.
Monica Rivera, I want to thank you very much for this conversation and this education.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Coming up after the break, fewer than half the states in the U.S. mandate sex education be taught in public schools. Ahead, how members of the LGBTQ+ community are working to make those classes more inclusive. This is CBSN, CBS News, always on.